Hello and welcome back to another nutrition coaching video. Today is all about dietary fats. The dietary fats we actually eat are known as triglycerides. These contain 9 calories per gram. It's important to differentiate between the saturated versus unsaturated sources because these have different impacts on our health. Fats are important for many physiological functions, which we'll go over in just a moment. And I recommend to select the healthiest sources and incorporate in the amount you need. So you should understand a little bit more about this by the end of the video today. Some of the many benefits of dietary fats include their necessity for hormone production. They provide necessary building blocks for our cell membranes. They keep our skin healthy. They keep you full after you have a meal or snacks that contain fat. And they also slow your stomach emptying, which is a good thing when you're trying to slow down the speed of digestion and absorption of things like carbohydrate. People tend to label cholesterol as bad because they've heard of too much cholesterol being a bad thing. I will explain this more in a moment, but the cholesterol we eat actually doesn't affect the cholesterol we have in our bloodstream. Cholesterol is a kind of fat that we eat, and it's a very important fat because it's a precursor to some of our hormones. Steroid hormones and adrenal hormones are actually made from cholesterol through a series of reactions. If you don't have cholesterol, then your body can't do this. We need testosterone, progesterone, and estrogen in differing amount in our bodies, and our bodies actually need cholesterol to be able to make these important things. Testosterone, progesterone, and estradiol are sex hormones which influence both physical and mental well-being, from osteoporosis and cancer to depression and premenstrual dysphoric disorder, whereas cortisol and aldosterone are collectively referred to as corticosteroids. This in detail does exceed the scope of today's coaching video. I just want to point this out to illustrate why it's important that we do have a minimum intake of fat in our diet as well as cholesterol. The absolute minimum level that I would recommend is about 0.5 gram per kilo of body weight. So if you are 60 kilos, for example, the minimum level of fat intake I would recommend would be at least 30 grams of fat through your diet. At the very basic structure of dietary fats, we have fatty acids and glycerol stuck together. This is a picture of just one fatty acid. We have a carboxyl group here and a long hydrocarbon chain, which just means carbons and hydrogens. That's illustrated by the little C's here. That means carbon, and these little things sticking out are hydrogens. Again, you don't need to know this, it's just to explain the structure of fats so you can understand the difference between saturated and unsaturated. When we look at it in a technical form, these long chains here are just 3 of these stuck together, and then we have glycerol as the backbone. When we eat dietary fat, our body breaks down this structure and it feeds glycerol into energy production cycles, and then it uses the fatty acids elsewhere. You would have heard of saturated fat and unsaturated fat before. The difference between these two is because of the molecular arrangement. Basically, all you need to know that saturated means there's no double bonds, which means it looks like this. This is the saturated fat at the top here. This second fatty acid here is a monounsaturated fat because it has one double bond, which I'm just circling here. Mono means one, hence this is monounsaturated. This third fatty acid down here at the bottom is a polyunsaturated fatty acid. Poly means many, and this has more than one or many double bonds, illustrated here, here, and here. Don't stress about the chemistry. Doesn't matter if it's going in one ear and out the other. It's just to illustrate there's a physical difference between saturated and unsaturated fats, and this affects cholesterol in our blood. Remember how I mentioned that dietary cholesterol has nothing to do with blood cholesterol? The thing that affects our blood level of cholesterol is the level of saturated fat intake. When it comes to your heart health, if we have saturated fat, this increases the bad cholesterol in our blood, which is bad for our hearts. This is known as LDL, or low density lipoproteins. LDL can actually get stuck in your arteries, which in turn clogs up your arteries and causes high blood pressure, and down the line can potentially cause heart conditions or even a heart attack if our coronary artery gets blocked with cholesterol. On the flip side, unsaturated fats increase our HDL, which is good cholesterol. HDL means high density lipoprotein. So the only difference between LDL and HDL is the density. Low density is bad, high density is good. The more HDL you have, the more protective this is for our hearts. This is because HDL moves around the blood vessels and picks up any spare LDL that's also floating around and returns it to our liver. This is good for our hearts. So unsaturated fats increases your good cholesterol, which is good for your heart. Here is a brief summary for you of the food sources of saturated and unsaturated fats. You'll notice over here in the saturated column, most of the saturated fat sources are from animal fats or dairy fats. This is why it's recommended to have lean sources of protein, to have low-fat cuts of meat, low-fat dairy, low-fat cheese, and to swap things like butter for olive oil. This is because these changes mean you increase your unsaturated fats and you decrease the saturated fats. One thing that might stand out for you here, which is a bit less obvious, is coconut oil. Coconut oil is a saturated fat. It's actually not good for you. Lots of people think coconut oil is the holy grail when it comes to health, and hopefully now that you understand a little bit more about saturated versus unsaturated fats, you'll realize that coconut oil is not the best thing for you. A good little tip to remember is that saturated fats are hard at room temperature. So when you have a fatty cut of meat sitting there, for example, a Scotch fillet, you can actually see a hard white section of fat around the edge. Likewise with lard, that's hard at room temperature, and so is coconut oil. The jar of coconut oil will always be hard at room temp unless it's a really, really hot day. Now looking at unsaturated fats, there's polyunsaturated, which have the many double bonds, or monounsaturated, which have one double bond. Both of these fats are really, really good for you, and you'll notice that most of these come from plant sources, like olives, avocados, nuts, seeds. One exception is fish. Fatty fish actually have a really high proportion of polyunsaturated fatty acids, particularly omega-3, and these are really protective for your heart health as well as your brain health. So I do recommend picking some of your dietary fats from things like salmon or other fatty fish. When it comes to fat-containing foods, don't confuse a fatty food with being fat. What I mean by this is, yes, avocado is a really good source of fat, but it also has water, fiber, and other nutrients. It's not just fat. The one exception to this rule is oils. Oils are 100% fat because they don't mix with water, there's no fiber, and there's no other structure in there. So if you have 5 grams of oil, you are eating 5 grams of fat, whereas everything else here is not 100% fat. I've outlined this in greater detail for you here, so you can see how many grams of fat each kind of food actually has per 100 grams of the food. So with oil, like I said, it's 100% fat. So per 100 grams of olive oil, you're getting 100 grams of fat. With nuts, per 100 grams of nuts, you're getting about 54 grams of fat. And we work all the way down the list here till we get down to eggs. One egg has about 6 or 7 grams of fat. If you are setting your macronutrients yourself, or not sure how much fat to have, there's a bit of a sliding scale here that I've included just so you have a bit more info. This depends on your personal preference. I recommend most people set fat between 0.6 to 1.0 grams per kilo body weight. If you are overweight or you have some excess fat that you'd like to lose, I recommend instead using your goal body weight for this setting. Because if you have an extra 30 kilos, for example, and you set your fat at 90 or 100 grams, that's a really high level. When it comes to personal preference, there are a few things which will impact your decision. I recommend a higher range of fat for people who are more sedentary. This is because the higher fat you have, the lower carbohydrate you'll eat, and if you're sedentary and you're not exercising much, you don't need as much carbohydrate. Another reason to set a higher range of fat is if you have insulin resistance. This refers to whether you can use insulin effectively in your body or not. Those who are diabetic or pre-diabetic or who have PCOS have insulin resistance. So I recommend for this group of people to set their fats a little bit higher and go more like 1.0 grams per kilo as opposed to 0.6 grams per kilo. Down the other end of the spectrum here at 0.6 grams per kilo, these are for people who are more active, who want more carbs from training, or who have higher muscle mass because they're more insulin sensitive. So the more insulin sensitive you are and the more carbohydrate you use, the less dietary fat I would recommend to set. Don't worry if you're looking at this thinking you're confused. I've done this for you if you're a nutrition coaching client. So just check the front page of your flexible diet plan to see where I've set your fat. And remember that fat will always be a bit of a range and a bit of a sliding scale. The more carbs you have, the less fat you'll have. The less carbs you have, the more fat you'll have. To recap, calories in food come from the macronutrients. Fat will give 9 calories per gram. So over here on this label, we can see that there's 5 grams of fat. Therefore, to figure out how many calories from fat on this label, we'd simply multiply 5 grams times 9 calories to get 45 calories from fat in this nutrition label. Triglycerides are made from 3 fatty acids plus 1 glycerol molecule. The structure of the bonds in the fatty acids dictates whether or not it's a saturated or unsaturated fat. Choose unsaturated fats as much as possible and limit saturated fat to 10 grams per day or under. Choose unsaturated fat as much as possible and limit your saturated fat intake to 10 grams a day or under. Fat-containing foods still contain other nutrients and water. 100 grams of avocado is not 100 grams of fat. It has only 13 grams of fat. So yes, it's a fat-containing food, but don't get too confused. And I recommend to set your fat in the range of 0.6 to 1.0 grams if you're setting your macronutrients. As always, please don't hesitate to reach out if you need any more help with this concept, and thank you for following along.